Marcel Boiteux is, to me, the highest example of a engineer for the people. He delivered an example, a living example of an energy system that is low cost, environmentally sustainable, and beautiful. And it's owned by the public of the nation for whom he built. And he did it in order to see through a vision. I mean, he was an economist by training. And he thought that this was the correct way forward economically. But in the end, almost anything like that can be negotiated. He had a vision of France where electricity was abundant, where it was as cheap as it should be, but no cheaper. And we'll get into that. And that human flourishing was after that left to the people.
Welcome back to Decouple. Today I'm joined by returning guest fan favorite Mark Nelson for a long-awaited episode. Mark, this is our third take, and I think this is because we are going to be touching on the life and work of a hero of yours, and we've really wanted to do this man justice. The man of the hour of today's hour, Mr. Marcel Boiteux, who is an architect of the French nuclear program and a real living, recently past legend. Made it past 100 years. I think the anniversary of his birthday is coming up later this week. We'll hopefully get the episode out on or around that day. Mark, great to have you back. Just very briefly, what do you love about Marcel Boiteux?
Marcel Boiteux is, to me, the highest example of a engineer for the people. And that's a weird thing to say because one, he wasn't an engineer by training. And two, he's not even that famous in France, ironically. But the reason why I think he's greatest is because he delivered an example, a living example of an energy system that is low cost, environmentally sustainable, and beautiful. And it's owned by the public of the nation for whom he built. And he did it in order to see through a vision. I mean, he was an economist by training, and he thought that this was the correct way forward economically. But in the end, almost anything like that can be negotiated. He had a vision of France where electricity was abundant, where it was as cheap as it should be, but no cheaper. And we'll get into that. And that human flourishing was after that left to the people.
Beautiful. So, Mark, we're going to, I think, tie this into a broader narrative. As we saw in the recent energy war and very real war in Ukraine, Europe was plunged almost into darkness, but certainly into a new era, which is one of rapid deindustrialization. And it was an era in which France truly should have shone. As natural gas flows were interrupted to Europe, the French nuclear fleet was not nowhere to be found, but I think it was operating close to a 50% capacity in terms of its installed generation to what it was putting out. So today's story, I think, is going to be interesting. And it's going to be as interesting in terms of understanding, the personalities, but also the era that produced these personalities. Post-war France is kind of post-war reconstruction. The building out of the infrastructure that has underpinned a lot of the prosperity of the nation. And then a kind of rot that came in. And I think, with nuclear, often we are awestruck by the engineering, the technology, the shiny objects, the massive, assemblages of concrete and steel. But often the human story is left out. We're going to tell that human story as it pertains to Monsieur Boiteux. But also, I think, touching a little bit on the rot that has come into nuclear. We've addressed that in another episode, but maybe the human story of that and sort of the cultural moment of the 60s, 1968 maybe in particular, and how that led to a new generation, which in some ways sabotaged the legacy that Marcel has left. And we're entering now into what seems to be a new epoch. One is reminded of the phrase, hard times make hard men make soft times, soft times make soft men, and soft men make hard times. It seems like we're going to be talking about a full revolution of that wheel. So, Mark, I'm going to try and sort of interrupt some of your longest flows here and keep this pretty conversational. but you did a great job there answering the first question briefly. So yeah, let's move in. We're going to be again part biography, but maybe before we get into that, just to set the scene again, just lay out for us the current state of the nuclear sector in France. You were showing me in some of our pre-chats the production profiles, I think, of Beaver Valley nuclear unit, for which much of the French fleet is based upon, and just how incredibly different the production is from those units. How well is the French fleet operating?
Well, in 2022, as you said, when all of Europe needed the French nuclear system the most, it was barely in action. We're talking a 51% capacity factor for the year from the remainder of the fleet after the French intentionally shut down and destroyed one of their finest 2-unit plants that had already been prepared for long life. So if you count those, it would have been under 50%. But just of the plants that were online in 2022, France operated at 51%. That is at the level of offshore wind. And anytime you're having to compare nuclear to renewables in terms of capacity factor, you've really messed up. And this is a fleet which shouldn't have had any problem meeting the demands of Europe. And the reasons for this are complex. There are many, but one of the biggest is that the spirit of excellence that Marcel Boiteux left EDF with, it seems to be totally broken. Now, EDF people are going to get really pissed and they're going to get angry, but look, in American parlance, I just got to say scoreboard. You just look at how much those nuclear plants are operating and it's awful. On one hand, they'll say, "Oh, our regulator was too harsh and shut things down." Well, EDF lost the battle to make that not happen. Whatever it would have taken to fight against unjust and irresponsible abuse of the regulatory apparatus, they didn't. They couldn't or didn't, or it's just, in the end, scoreboard. They were not available when it counted the most. Here's another one. The French claim that they don't have enough market for their electricity. Well, that's a marketing problem, and you answer that with marketing better. And if they claim, "Oh, well, we couldn't market more electricity because of all these laws limiting us that say that our competitors have to take first priority on the grid, or even though renewables are no more low carbon than we are, we have to make room for them," whatever. That's still that broken spirit, that broken spine in some ways that EDF let small, pathetic, private interests dominate that of their mission to deliver power when it was needed most in Europe. Now, if I had been an EDF, would I do a better job? I have no idea. I don't know. Maybe if I would have done a better job, I would have been cleaned clear out of EDF long before. In 2017, when I met on a research trip to understand what was starting to go so wrong in France, because they were promulgating all these decrees to start stripping down their fleet and destroy their own reactors. I did a research trip over there with Environmental Progress and Michael Schellenberger's support. And what we discovered was, for the young engineers, if you were pro-nuclear at EDF, you had to hide it. You had to not tell people that you were too in to what produced 90% of their power and 95% of the actual profits of EDF Group. You had to pretend it wasn't, it's not cool, so I'm not going to say I'm uncool by calling it cool. That's the EDF we were left with going into the energy crisis in 2021 that then was used as a launch pad for invasion in early 2022.
So, we've stated this kind of grand ambition of this program, of this podcast, and hopefully we'll be able to get to discussing, the change in mentality. But before we do, let's harken back to the life and times of Marcel Boiteux and the construction of EDF into the institution that it was, and maybe the sort of peak of its performance. Truly extraordinary accomplishment in the setting of a severe lack of endogenous fossil fuels like coal and gas, to develop at such breakneck speed under the Messmer plan this enormous nuclear fleet. So again, there's a human story behind this. Usually I'm not a huge fan of the sort of great man theory of history, but I think in this case, it'll be an entertaining way to approach it. And it sounds like this man deserves a tribute, and certainly is not well known outside of France, and perhaps not well enough known in France. So Mark, the floor is yours. Tell us a little bit about Marcel Boiteux.
Sure. So Marcel Boiteux was born May 9th, 1922. most of my source for this episode, at least on his biography and his decision making and thinking, comes from his, as far as I can tell, only published memoir. This was the book Haute Tension, or High Tension, and it was published in 1993, 5 years after Marcel stepped away from leadership of EDF when the nuclear build campaign was coming to its final stages, the final well built plants and then quick constructions were coming to a conclusion, and these last four large plants that would presage the future with extremely long build times stretched out forever and ever, that really sets up EDF for the entity we know and love today, with its nearly unlimited time and cost giant plant construction. He left really kind of near the peak, I'd say, and he left it in extraordinary condition, in my opinion. So Marcel published these memoirs, Haute Tension. They are out of print. You can buy the PDF. It's quite expensive, but you can buy the PDF. And if you show that PDF to EDF leaders, I haven't found a single one that's ever read it. Most of them have heard of the memoirs. All of them have heard of Marcel Boiteux. But I think if we have one big goal here, it's not so much even to inspire the public, though. For me as a young man, I'm almost talking to 18-year-old Mark, what I would have wanted to hear with grand ambitions, what was possible in the world, what history can teach us. No. What I really want to do is inspire those at EDF and those who govern EDF as now a fully returned to state control institution. I want to inspire them to the legacy and life of the man who built what they are so capriciously mismanaging. So here we go. Marcel Boiteux, born May 9th, 1922. He had a much stronger family on his mom's side than his dad. He barely talks about his dad's side. His dad sounds like a fairly strange duck from with heritage from the far east of the country near Germany, where his surname comes from. Repeatedly, Marcel jokes in his book about Boiteux, his surname also meaning lame or crippled. And several times this comes up in humor when he was injured in the Italian campaign in World War II and was worried that he would be left with a permanent limp as somebody named lame. But
Right.
that's his dad's family barely factors in the book, but his mom's family is a strong, persistent factor in his upbringing. His parents separated when he was young, and he was very much under the influence of his mom's side of the family. On his mom's side, there was a long line of scientists and academics. He had a long family history at the university he ended up attending, ENS, École Normale Supérieure in Paris. So sort of one of the grand écoles, one of the great institutions of French education. Is what he attended, but not as an engineer. So his grandfather on his mom's side and his grandmother were both huge personalities, and his mother was also a strong personality. For he describes himself as very shy, very small, very cautious and quiet as a child, who did not do well in school as a young kid. In fact, he says that much of his later success can only really be due to his mother, a school teacher, absolutely insisting and calling in favors and persuading Marcel's teachers to continue to pass him or accept him on into harder subjects despite his poor marks and poor results in lower ones. So he really attributes his academic success, which was slow in coming. He sort of accelerated into university years with his mother's forceful advocacy of his own prospects.
Of course, those university years are interrupted by World War II, if I'm doing my math correctly, being born in
Yeah,
1922.
and I just want to mention that Marcel gravitated towards math and science, not because he felt he was better at them. He felt early on he was better at writing and better at reading, and he would try to get out of chores that his grandparents gave him by quoting and making arguments from the Bible, which he said it really annoyed his grandmother. But that verbal skill he found wasn't as exciting to him as math because he couldn't figure out why he was getting grades in classes. So this starts a intensely analytical and economics focused, an evaluation and appraisal focused view that I think he retained throughout his whole career and really helped him when he was, in some ways, chief engineer of French energy, having to stand up against powerful bands of politically connected actual engineers from the top engineering schools. So World War II did interrupt. It's kind of astonishing to read. He was too young to be part of the military when France fell. I mean, he was 17, 18 during those frightful years. And his father was not big on using black markets. His mother wasn't able to help much because they were sort of downwardly mobile as a family, ending up in Marseille. And he was able to eat so little that he was constantly hungry. And despite his hunger, he would still go run around his house when preparing for entrance exams for college. He would have to run around his house because there was no heating fuel just to get enough warmth to be able to go to bed and fall asleep. So we're talking an extremely hungry, thin, energetic young man in a fallen France. So the Vichy regime, which was set up by the Nazis to govern the remainder of France that wasn't under direct German occupation, created a regime of forced labor. And this created one of the most astonishing things I discovered when reading about Boiteux. All these young students were forced to do labor by the Vichy government. What Marcel Boiteux had to do, he had to work in a coal mine under barbaric conditions, basically, shoveling coal and jackhammering a really worn out, nearly finished coal seam for the Nazis. Yeah, that's right. Marcel Boiteux, who later built the French nuclear program that came up against the political influence of Germany and its massive coal program and anti-nuclear sentiment. He cut his teeth as a laborer for a week doing, basically corvée labor, one step above slavery, in coal mines, shoveling coal for the Nazi war regime. And he did it under the directorship of his own government, Vichy. And boy, I feel, without being able to draw direct parallels to the Nazi regime in modern times, I could really feel this in the last few years of France intentionally devastating its own proper energy program at the beck and call of German officials who had managed to get sway over French thinking, and French officials proudly boasting how they crippled their own government's nuclear program and nuclear position within the EU in order to meet German needs for a coal and renewable future without nuclear. And the fact that he did that for a week and it never shows up in like the story of where the French nuclear program comes from, in my opinion, shows a lack of curiosity and imagination on behalf of today's French nuclear leaders.
Okay, so forced labor in a coal mine didn't last long.
No, he escaped. He got warning that something bad was going to happen, and it was also very dangerous to work in a coal mine. So as a 21-year-old student, he escapes, meets up with the resistance, says the last goodbye to his mother in the south of France, and shepherds 5 downed American pilots over the border, past the border guards, into Spain, gets to the American embassy, turns over the flyers. The Americans get him to French forces or get him to the British in Gibraltar. The Gibraltar get him to the Free French forces in Africa. He joins up with the forces that combine under General de Gaulle, and he gets commissioned as an officer, hastily trained in the artillery corps as somebody who could barely carry anything because he was so weak and skinny. And he gets shipped off to Italy, where he wins the War Cross for valor. He claims that he didn't do anything special compared to his mates. He just was liked by his superior, which is a thing that will come back over and over in Marcel Boiteux's life. He's liked by his superior, disclaims too much responsibility for his own excellence, gets promoted by superiors who need good people, and gets rewarded for his service at that level. So he gets injured in the Italian campaign, sent home. Good surgeon makes sure that Boiteux doesn't end up lame.
It's not lame.
And he returns to his university, where he undergoes the final years of his education.
And this is now in liberated France.
This gets us up to 1945, 1946, liberated France. He
give us a context of kind of, I know you're not like a French historian, but from your understanding, what France looks like in this period. I mean, this is an era of I mean, I guess, there was plans to destroy Paris. I think Hitler had ordered one of his generals to, you know, I'm not sure what kind of charges they put on the Eiffel Tower, but basically, really destroy that beautiful city. But it was spared, I think, in some ways. Obviously, the devastation that Eastern Europe underwent. But yeah, what did post-war France look like? I guess from that perspective of the consciousness of the society as well as its kind of infrastructure, particularly, I guess, its electricity infrastructure.
Well,
If you want to go
better
there.
to be post-war France than post-war Germany, to be sure. But and let me actually add a little bit from an American perspective, and we can talk to French people and fill in that era a little better. But from an American perspective, I've been studying this period recently because some of the figures around the creation of the atomic weapons establishment in the U.S., the creation of the Atomic Energy Commission and its governing decisions in the early years that some people claim put it towards this way in this type of reactors or that way in that type of reactors. It's very interesting to me. Well, from an American diplomatic perspective, we had helped win World War II. We felt we'd fairly divided up Europe into zones of occupation and rebuilding. And then we were struck that all over Europe, from east spreading west, small bands of revolutionaries were looking to topple or overthrow the governments that remained, whether elected, appointed, or grandfathered in. There, it suddenly was. We went from a great victory to the American people are tired, want to go home, but yet Europe seems to be collapsing into governments that owe direct power, authority, and allegiance to Moscow. Suddenly, Europe seemed to be falling apart with hungry bands everywhere, included in the victorious countries. There was not enough food to go around. There was enough humiliation to go around. There was enough embarrassment to go around. And old Europe was left radically weaker than any of the two emergent superpowers, the Soviet Union and the United States. So the way this was experienced in France was a shred of dignity retained by it being de Gaulle's forces marching into Paris, a French leader marching into Paris, liberating France for the French by the French, but yet a generation shamed by Vichy cooperation with the Nazis, reckoning with neighbors turning in Jewish French neighbors only a few decades after the uh, infamous Dreyfus affair. You had a lot of stuff to deal with, and you had a young generation that, beyond a shadow of a doubt, had proven themselves brave, hardy, loyal. They'd proven themselves survivors, and this was the young generation that Marcel Boiteux was a part of. One of my favorite books on this subject is by the anti-nuclear historian and scientific historian Gabriel Hecht. I've waved this around on podcasts before. This is The Radiance of France, which is intended to be an ambiguous insult to the French nuclear program, saying that irradiation or the radiation of France rather than just the radiance of France. But anyway, it's still a great first dive into this world of French men, mostly men, attempting to restore the grandeur of France that not only had been knocked out in the opening months of the Western Front War, but also was starting to lose its colonies around the world and was struggling with the definition of what it meant to be a proud uh, post-imperial France. And part of that definition found its way into rebuilding the energy sector through a nationalized utility that then was developing and finally deploying nuclear energy on a scale never before seen.
What were the kind of anxieties about energy security like in France in that period? I mean, there's a number of reasons why Germany lost the war. One of them had to do with a lack of oil. This was it was fascinating learning about the degree of horse-drawn materiel movement that the Nazis did compared to the vast fleets of diesel trucks that the Allies ended up having. But we're merging more and more into the era of oil at this point. France has colonies, but was there a sense of vulnerability? They were burning a lot of oil for electricity. Obviously, the nuclear weapons program, I think, was one of the first things that was really pursued ambitiously. The Maginot Line had failed. Perhaps an atomic Maginot Line would prevent any kind of humiliation of France in the future. But I'm just curious in terms of the origins of the pursuit of nuclear power in France. Was that just the excitement around trying to pursue the peaceful use of the atom, or was it really tied into a discourse around energy security in that post-war period?
Whatever the discourse was around energy security, it wasn't enough. And France was almost totally blindsided, as was much of the world, by the oil embargo of 1973. And we can jump ahead to that, but let me just say France built a lot of fossil generation to go with their dams, and the nuclear program was slow in coming, and there was hesitation in which direction to go over many years. And Marcel Boiteux himself had to get a sort of energy philosophy division going. An energy philosopher under him wrote a paper in, I believe, 1972, saying cheap oil until when. But even then, that was an outsider view, and anyone who would have wanted to criticize his leadership, whether from a anti-nuclear standpoint or just as a critique the top, cut the tall daisy perspective, could have said, "Oh, of course you're saying we're going to suddenly get cut off of this oil that's been totally fine for decades." As if, yeah. So let me guess, you're going to propose you just have to build a bunch of nuclear plants at EDF? Oh, yeah, I see. And also, EDF had to contend, Marcel Boiteux personally had to contend with extremely heavy lobbying from the nationalized coal sector. And that wasn't just for coal electricity, Chris, because electricity was seen as being an EDF thing, but it was decentralized coal burning and direct use of coal in industrial processes. It was a really intense fight where Marcel felt undercut at every turn by the national coal people. Even worse, and this really stung him during the embargo, and finally his prognostications that they had to be ready for fossil fuels and energy security becoming an issue. When that happened, EDF watched the national coal people who've been lobbying for this resell their own coal shipments for France overseas for a profit for the national coal folks at the expense of EDF's generating stations that were supposed to be able to count on coal. In fact, he'd been told he had to buy coal and be ready for that. And he found the coal being reshipped elsewhere for trading profits from the supposedly nationally oriented coal infrastructure. And now, for any of your center right listeners, it's not going to surprise anyone that if you build a great state infrastructure to do great state engineering, whether nuclear or not, like any power structure, that can be corrupted. And the fear might be that in the more pure politically oriented structure connected with the state, you could have an even more extreme distortion from politics on what's supposed to be for the national interest. I think that's one of the reasons in my opening rant about Marcel Boiteux and being a great state engineer, he didn't just say yes to doing things because it made EDF more powerful or the state more powerful. He insisted on some kind of economic cost evaluation of what was actually good for society as a whole, not just the ministry that governed him or his own organization. And obviously, that's an ideal. Maybe we can never reach. And I'm yet to see a big takedown of Marcel Boiteux that has any economic or nuclear literacy. It's all, we don't like him because he did nuclear. He represented EDF. He conquered France with his nuclear stations. It's not interesting to me. That a lot of those are really dumb critiques in the long light of history of what's evolved. Even if I couldn't have said that in 1980, I can say it now quite firmly. Until I see a critique of Marcel Boiteux on the economic decision making, I just have to see the results, point at the scoreboard, and said he was an extraordinary man who seemed to have avoided these issues, a small-minded parochialism of what I just described with the coal board causing and then exploiting for its profit energy insecurity in France. And obviously there was energy insecurity. It was a famous quote, actually, as far as I can tell, it was amended by Sarkozy himself. We don't have oil, but we have ideas. We don't have oil, we don't have gas, we don't have coal, but we have ideas. That was Sarkozy's, as far as we can tell, his extension of the energy insecurity quote to point towards why he was pro-nuclear.
So there's this tension and balance here between telling the narrative arc of Boiteux's life and the contextualization. So I feel like we jumped ahead a little bit with the context there, but yeah, let's catch ourselves up now in terms of that early post-war period and Marcel rising to be, I'm not sure how quickly he heads to being the head of EDF, but I'm super curious about how he plays the war, both in what we're going to touch on, I think, the War of the Systems, France's decision to abandon its indigenous reactor technology, and the Messmer plan. So yeah, fill us in on those sort of 20 tumultuous years, post-war and into that period.
Until he becomes head of EDF. So first of all, He was a skinny, underfed academic. He graduated with a program that he invented. He invented his own program of doing both the math and the hard sciences plus economics. And he actually had to go over to a radically different famous institution, Sciences Po, to study economics. He claims he became interested in economics because of influential friends who were obsessed by political economy issues of the day. Could you make a centrally managed economy be efficient? How would you even calculate what efficiency of centrally managed looks like? So he got pulled into economics through friends who he would debate all night with during the free and hungry days of his occupied France education. When he went back to his studies, he continued to pursue economics as one of his major disciplines. He ended up doing being assigned to a professor, one of the great economics professors who had these two star students, Marcel Boiteux and another. They drew straws to see who would receive funding from the Americans to go overseas to finish their postgraduate work in America. That economist ended up winning the Nobel Prize, but Marcel stayed back, never perfected English as he said it, and rose to be head of EDF in barely 20 years. The professor got his student Marcel Boiteux involved in several pricing analyses. So first, the railroads were having severe profitability issues. There was this dogma of every mile for every ton has to be priced the same. That's equality. But that ignored the radical difference between heavy cargo that took up tiny amounts of space and light cargo that took up huge amounts of space and had very delicate packaging or difficult handling per ton. And he found the railroads in disarray with a rigid dogma that was economics, even if people wouldn't claim it as economics, that he was able to show to the railroads they had to do preferential rates for different types of shipping or they'd leave everything to the roads. In the meantime, his advisor also got him involved with calculations for the roads. Should the roads and rails both be monopolized? And if the roads are monopolized for trucking, how does that look? Well, so Marcel Boiteux got into one of his first political problems of his life, being found to be doing work for two organizations that were both advocating against each other for more resources and for better treatment from the government under nationalization. During one of his free classes, so he would teach as a professor free classes at one of the free universities of Paris, a man came up to him, and this guy turned out to be the head of electricity pricing at the newly nationalized Electricite de France, and said, "Can you come work for me part-time on figuring out how we should price electricity as a socialized entity?" So in the late 1940s, 1948, he entered EDF and would stay there for 30 years.
And how did he answer that question? How do you price socialized electricity or nationalized
So this
electricity?
is what's interesting about the book, Chris. There's only a few pages about how he built the nuclear program that he's so famous for now. There are entire chapters breaking down his exploration, not just the conclusions, but the explorations of the economics of electricity production. So one of the analogies that Marcel Boiteux uses and shows in his memoirs is that of lumber. So if you have people saying, "Wait, this is a big socialist electricity entity. We're households. Why are we paying more than factories?" Or the factories saying, "Why are I, as an existing factory located next to an already paid off power plant, why am I having to get my rates jacked up by this new pricing scheme to pay for new power plants that I don't even need?" So all of these interests have to be balanced against each other. And in terms of the grid or the distribution that, say, here in the US, clean energy experts have suddenly in the last few years discovered the grid. It's quite phenomenal. Well, Boiteux has the lumber analogy where the price for merely cut logs are never going to be the same price per ton of wood as they are for the planed and milled planks or the 2x4s that you find distributed all the way to your hardware store. These are all wood from the same tree, but they're not the same thing. They require radically different processing. They're sold in very different volumes and scales, and they need different infrastructure along the way. So, this is one of his analogies that he developed upon having to learn about electricity in order as an economist, as a professional economist, to price it. One of the issues is that there were different rates for different times of day. So that's an idea that's very old, but they were set as a small premium on top of a fixed rate. And because of inflation and the war, the fixed rate had grown so much that the time of day use rates were kind of like this, almost like the same situation I found in California in 2016 when I moved to San Francisco, that unfolding catastrophic electricity mismanagement. I found the same thing. There was all these things about needing to save energy as the sun was going down, but it was so expensive to run the mismanaged grid that they have that the actual price difference between the different times of day were very small. And sure enough, just because an individual person at one end of the long path of distribution turns down, it doesn't guarantee that that's the savings you need any one particular crisis day in the long run. So a lot of his text is about this issue between averages and marginal cost. Why he proved using theory and reams of paper and long rants at directors of EDF why you had to create a theory of marginalist pricing, as in what is the price that was able to fund or pay for the next unit of power plant, while also taking into account the needs of developing the country. He was against subsidizing what he saw as unprofitable uses of electricity with artificially low electricity rates. This was one of my big findings that shocked me. And by the way, in defending these pricings, developing the theory, pitching it to his mentors and his patrons within EDF, winning political battles against the various interests, like entire regions that said we should get a cheaper rate because we want to attract electricity users, or rural electrification that said, look, we've always had this way we've done it. We deserve to keep having it. Getting involved in EDF should be advantage, but not disadvantage. He carefully managed the politics of explaining his technical vision and then delivering it, and then that vision working. That's what he did to show that people should keep promoting him through the ranks. Some of his promotions, by the way, after putting in case these prices and negotiating against these titans of interest in France, like the god of rural electrification, had a beautiful life. Gilberton is the guy's name, George Gilberton. He was a titanic figure who was on the board of EDF. And when Marcel's own patron, who brought him into EDF, who came to his lecture and brought him into EDF, Gabriel Dessus, when that guy got into such a severe conflict as a director of EDF, one of the 8 directors of EDF, with this board member, George Gilberton, who was the god of rural electricity and rural electricity cooperatives, Gabriel Dessus had to be forced out of EDF because the board had to have the confidence of this godfather of rural electrification. Because Marcel Boiteux had been the diplomat, carefully going back and forth between his own boss and this god of rural electrification, he was in the perfect position to get the tap, to get the nod, to be escalated to become the youngest director of EDF. I don't know if he was youngest ever, but in 1958, he replaced his mentor and his patron because of that patron leaving, because of the not being able to survive political battles. So what we're seeing in this theme is that he can get the theory done. He can work all night. I mean, his patron, Gabriel Dessus, clearly brought him in as a brilliant economist, but also told him after one confusing attempt by Marcel Boiteux to explain his economic reasoning around the marginal pricing of electricity to all users because of the cost of the last unit of power plant needed. Gabriel Dessus said, this is theory. You can do this in the nighttime. In the daytime, I must have prices. So, as the theory guy who came up with the practical pricing scheme, and then was part of the political back end getting cooperation from the powers that be at EDF to get it implemented, he found himself being promoted without, as far as I can tell, a lot of normal forceful presence or charisma that would normally have led somebody to seek power or be rapidly promoted. So when Marcel Boiteux looks inside himself for why he might have been promoted like this, he finds that because of his long family history of academics, the shy, embarrassed, quiet, uncomfortable leader that he was as a young lieutenant or as a young professor disappeared when he was giving an academic lecture in front of a class. Maybe a terrible skill much later in life if you're trying to defend to the public and to reporters who are skeptical of lectures. why you're doing the nuclear program, but in the world that needed to be built off of some kind of rationality in the face of chaos, he was exactly the sort of young man whose iron will in defending ideas and making them practical was what was seen as the iron leadership that got him promoted all the way to the top without ever having to so-called command in front of the enemy in France. That in France, what that means is being a manager face to face across a table with the powerful labor unions demanding concessions or they'll shut down your facility. So Marcel was promoted all the way to the top position in 1967, late 1967, less than a year before the May riots. He was promoted to boss of EDF without ever having commanded in front of the enemy, without ever having to have faced off to these powerful, huge, persistent labor unions that were demanding higher wages.
Boy, was that coming. Let's get caught up then a little bit with France's nascent civilian nuclear power program. I'm guessing there's some overlap, as there often is in nuclear weapon states. This gas graphite system, was that partially to produce plutonium for its weapons? Was it sort of a dual use tool? Let's talk a little bit about the war of the systems.
The most important thing from EDF's perspective, not being involved in the weapons, is that the gas graphite system was entangled in arguments about French national sovereignty, French greatness, and especially a less need to rely on anybody else for uranium enrichment. Before France got large-scale, cheap commercial enrichment, the gas graphite program apparently made it possible for France to only rely on its own mines and mills and raw natural uranium. The graphite helped make the most out of the neutrons available, shall we say, without using the dreaded word neutron economy. Let's just say the gas graphite program, which was as English as it was French. That's the funny thing. It wasn't any more French than it was English. So it was a line of development that was being pursued by the CEA, the Commissariat Energy Atomique, so their equivalent of Atomic Energy Commission. It was being pursued, and it wasn't just that the technology was more French, or at least it wasn't American, like a Westinghouse pressurized water reactor license. It was also that the fuel supply before enrichment was seen as more securely French. What happened, though, several things. One, there was a split in the CEA for the pressurized water reactor versus the gas graphite reactor. This is something that's not covered well in some sources, like in Radiance of France, in my opinion, where the developers of the nuclear submarine reactor and its on-land prototype, the PAT, prototype à terre. Well, these folks in CEA said, no, PWRs are good. We see them operating well in our subs and in Westinghouse fleets growing around the world. We see that EDF is growing experience with this by their participation in Tihange in Belgium. We think that this is the way to go. We just want you to expand our 1 megawatt prototype up to being the national model. So this shows some of the brilliance and the navigation of Marcel Boiteux. He did not like the idea that he would build a national energy program around a 1 megawatt design scaled up to 1,000 megawatts when he was having to plan out where electricity comes from, at what price, in which areas, right? He did not like the idea of scaling it up. And he said this 1 megawatt scaled up to 1,000 megawatt design would be a mille-pattes or like a millipede, like a bug, like an insect with many legs, right? PAT, prototype à terre, mille-pattes, I'm assured that is a hysterical pun in French. But that word ended up having a huge amount of power, persuading people to do what they never thought they wanted to do, pay an American company for a license to American technology to pursue the greatness of France. But that's, in the end, what they did. Now, it wasn't just American Westinghouse license. EDF was strongly considering and wanted to consider boiling water reactors. So there was a American-French consortium to do PWRs. There was a French-European consortium to do BWRs. And what happened was, when the crisis arrived, which we'll mention, that 1973 critical moment that turned the course of energy history, when that moment arrived, and hard decisions had to be made. The BWR crew had one last chance to put in pricing, and what they put in was about 20% above the PWR pricing. And Boiteux said, no, we're not doing it. It's PWR. This is our one thing. We've got to make it work.
And was there a sense of urgency here? I'm just trying to get the timeline. So this the project at there, the 1 megawatt plant. When was this built? Was this some premonitions of oil shock coming or the need to rapidly build out a nuclear fleet?
No,
I
not
imagine it would
really.
have.
Marcel Boiteux had to fight to get EDF and his ministries prepared for if cheap oil was going to cut off. There was considered time to develop the best nuclear program. Like, what's the real rush? It wasn't that people didn't want to build nuclear and get funded as fast as possible for their research. It's just that they wanted the decision to remain open for longer so that more ideas had a chance to play. I mean, especially ones that appeared in hindsight with great uncertainty, acknowledged by everyone, as being cheaper or more expensive. So if you had with high uncertainty, a more expensive system like the gas graphite system, which was physically, according to Marcel Boiteux, his feeling was that the gas graphite program was brilliant, too complicated, too expensive. That was what his feeling was. And when the PAT was being designed and built, there was no premonition of the oil shock. It was just they needed French submarine reactors. The CEA got the job done and got the submarine reactors going, and they wanted that to expand into a lineage of purely French, zero license dependency, pressurized water reactors for commercial electricity production. What is clear during this period is that the plants had to be larger, 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 larger. This was still the period where fuel cycle costs were very expensive and economies of scale were really pressing. Almost every SMR company is starting to see this, where the closer you get to a finalized detailed design, the more you see that the massive systems you need are barely any more massive. They're a lot more massive once you do detailed design. They're barely more massive when you scale up the reactor. That's the key thing that was driving us towards larger reactors. And so it was very clear that the newest 3-loop 900 megawatt Westinghouse units were the starting point from the perspective of EDF, from the perspective of Marcel Boiteux himself. That was the starting point of profitability in electricity generation.
I guess just go a little bit more into this national psyche then, in terms of this preoccupation with maintaining French independence, independent technology, a lack of dependence on enriched fuel. How did Marcel deal with that? And it seems that in the end, France got a pretty good deal, going Westinghouse in terms of IP control, and I think they negotiated a minority stake for Westinghouse in Framatome eventually, really leveraging the fact that they planned to build a lot of these things to get a good deal. So maybe walk us through that a little bit if Marcel was indeed involved in that.
Right. Well, this is the part that's going to get me kicked out of France. But as far as I can tell, almost anything France has done with nuclear construction has been worse the further they were away from Westinghouse. So here's what I mean by that. It's not clear to me, and I've asked my friends in South Africa to see what they can find. It's not clear to me how much money the French have ever made exporting. Because once they export to a country, that country doesn't really want more French exports in that country. We don't have a situation for France like we do in, say, China with Westinghouse, where China has a bad experience with Westinghouse and then keeps ordering over and over and over again. In China, French design was brought in. In Korea, the French design was brought in. In South Africa, French design. In many places, the French design was brought in with different degrees of separation from Westinghouse, to be true. But in almost all these cases, it was brought in as a starter for that country to develop their own technology, or that country didn't build any more reactors. So EDF in the UK, if they sell 2 more EPRs, then that will be one of the first examples we've seen of a country saying, yes, I see how the French build. I'd like 2 more of those, please. Except for that, it's been mostly countries saying, we'll take the technology, but we'll manage it from here, or we'll turn it into our own design, kind of like what the French did with Westinghouse. So what the French did that was spectacular, that's never been achieved truly other places, in my opinion. I mean, I guess in Korea a bit when they got combustion engineering designs. The French were able to take a Westinghouse design, standardize around a best-in-class design, and execute it over and over and over with extraordinary discipline and leadership from Marcel Boiteux and his enforcer that he brought in to just crush goals and get this thing built with a discipline that was more, I don't know, less engineering and more like a Leslie Groves from the Manhattan Project.
Right, right. And I think you had a story about that Bulldog actually occupying a nuclear site to get it
Yeah,
moving.
so
This is sort of like a
Marcel
uh,
Boiteux says that the
yeah.
number one thing he did to execute the nuclear program was to appoint Michel Hug, a French guy who got his PhD from University of Iowa in the early 50s and came back to France. I'm still trying to figure out his story. Look, there are all these legends who built France who ought to be celebrated, who ought to be studied. There ought to be bios and statues all over. There should be plaques on childhood homes in France and where they lived and worked elsewhere. And I don't see that, which in my opinion, we're not going to have greatness till we celebrate those who delivered the greatness we claim to be able to copy or meet, much less exceed. So Michel Hug, Hug, for those looking him up at home, uh, he knew that his mandate was to do what it took to build the plants. And Marcel Boiteux knew that his mandate was to keep Michel alive, to keep him from hurting too many other people or organizations, and to keep him, protected against his own, I don't know,
And just to
deviating.
clarify, Mark, are we at the point where we're heading into sort of a crash build
Oh,
program
absolutely.
because
This
the
is full
OPEC
crash
crisis
build.
has hit? Yeah.
Then let me just say this: the moment that the Messmer plan came into being was not the moment it was announced in early 1974. The oil crisis hit, and a few days later, in late 1973, Marcel Boiteux was at his desk at 9 a.m. on a Saturday, which is another thing that's not at all particularly French nowadays. Marcel Boiteux was at his desk 9 a.m. on a Saturday, and he got a call from the prime minister's office. It was the head of energy. And the head of energy said to him, in 3 hours by noon, I need you to tell me, based on your capabilities and the industries of France, how many reactors per year from here on out can we deliver? And Marcel Boiteux hangs up the phone, starts calling his subordinates again, 9 a.m. on a Saturday, and by noon gets the answer back from his big network of industrial partners and EDF colleagues. He says 5 to 6 per year. That number sort of was pushed up to 7 to 6, but in the end, 5 to 6 per year is what they set out to deliver. And it was considered almost incomprehensible. Just to put that in perspective, with about 50 million people, France was set to do 5 or 6 approximately 1 gigawatt reactors per year. China is now by far the biggest builder of nuclear in the world, with what will soon be 10 reactors per year. So 10 reactors per year for 1.3, 1.4 billion people versus 5 to
Wow.
6 per year, just barely smaller size from a country of 50 million.
Okay. Okay. Back to Hug,
Right.
or
So he
however you pronounce
appoints
it.
he
HUG.
appoints his
For
bulldog.
those following at home and looking up the
Yeah, he
names.
appoints his bulldog in
Decouple
charge.
nerds.
And one morning, when there was starting to be public resistance against these nuclear plants going in, partly it would be from the anti-nuclear movement, which I'm sure we'll touch on, but partly it was that once local areas saw the importance to the state, the importance to the country of getting these nuclear plants in, they rightfully saw, as should be their local responsibility, that they probably should try to get more out of EDF, out of France, if their communities were going to be irrevocably changed forever. They should put a price on that. Well, there was an issue developing in one of these communities. I'm not sure which nuclear plant this ended up being. I'll need to look it up. Where Michel Hug, on a Sunday evening, occupied the site with his men and his bulldozers and fencing material, called Marcel Boiteux on a Monday morning saying, hey, there's going to be some trouble. We've occupied the site. Sorry about that. If you need to sack me, you can sack me. Bye. And in the end, after a huge amount of fuss, Michel Hug was on very good terms, according to Marcel, within a short period of time with the local authorities. where they may have taken it and then paid off the local authorities with concessions and extra prizes. I don't know, because this particular history either isn't in English or isn't fully explored. All of these subjects, Chris, we have an actual energy transition executed in living memory by people, some of whom are still alive. I keep finding that so many of these people who appear in this set of memoirs and afterwards, they appear to have all died like last year or in the few years preceding. We have a small amount of time to find the people who are still sharp, are still interested in talking and sharing their story and helping us understand how these men executed so well. And I think we should. I think we've got to do that. But after the oil shock, 1973, late 1973, the order goes in secretly, quietly to EDF. How many can you build? Don't announce anything. Just get ready to rock and roll. In 1974, the plan was announced, and it was no surprise to EDF. In fact, EDF had been, if anything, a brake on the government wanting even more nuclear. Whereas people from the outside see it as EDF exerting its control and forcing the government into building a lot of nuclear plants that it didn't need. The big surprise to EDF, to Marcel Boiteux, was the enrichment plant announced for what is now um, uh, there's a nuclear plant in the south of France with the Georges Best enrichment facility. This is the Eurodif enrichment facility, which, by the way, is still co-owned with Iran, because the Shah of Iran put up $1 billion as a loan to France in order to get that enrichment plant up and running so that France could build
Wow.
PWRs in Iran. How about that for a story?
That's a wild story. We got
And
to
Iran
dig into
still
that some
owns it,
later episode.
10% of that Eurodif to this day.
Unreal. What a connection. Okay, so I'm trying to sort of pick up our paces here in terms of where
So
we're
we've
at,
got the
because I do
launch of
want to
this
get
great
into
nuclear program. They knew in advance that
Yeah.
1977 was going to get really rough, right? Because 1978, the first nuclear plants are coming online. Old fossil fuel units are coming to the end of their lifetime. Load growth was continuing. They knew it would be rough. And sure enough, there were some power outages that led to a lot of recriminations against EDF and Boiteux's leadership. But we're well underway. Now I think you wanted to get to the culture and how France managed to turn so anti-nuclear.
Yeah, absolutely. So you mentioned 1968. I was just doing a quick little crash. I won't even give it the dignity of a deep dive, but very interesting moment. I think 20% of French or 30% of French people are under 20 at this age, so very young population, and still a lot of unemployment. I think 30% of the country was making minimum wage. And a student-led protest started over, I think, anti-Vietnam War concerns, wanted mixed
Anti-capitalism,
dormitories,
ecology. It was
anti-capitalism,
really the
cultural,
classic
yeah.
eternal student protest material.
But it really spreads into this massive general strike, and the labor unions getting involved. So it seems like it diverges a little bit from what we are probably more used to as North Americans. The emergence of the new left, the kind of hippie counterculture, and the left really moving from the factory into the academy. It was interesting to me that there was still this was a really unifying moment for trade unions and students. But yeah, let's chat a little bit about that, because we've explored a little bit this persona who built EDF to what it is or what it became, maybe left at its heyday. But certainly the rot has set into EDF and the French nuclear fleet, and I'm interested in understanding the human story as to why that is.
First of all, this was a set of social revolutions that were rocking Marcel Boiteux when he was a year into one of the most prominent public entities in the entire country. Right, he was only a year in, and at that point he was mid 40s. He was very, very young and had never commanded in front of the enemy, negotiated directly against labor unions, and now he was into what is still, in some ways, a high water mark of labor union action in the Western world. So this ended up being a formative experience for Marcel Boiteux, and probably made a lot of who we saw developing the nuclear program and executing it. So Boiteux actually spends way more time in his memoirs on this subject, the negotiations around wages, and in the years after the general strike, he spends more pages on that than he does on the nuclear construction program. Partly it may be because he said he would get to the nuclear construction program in later memoirs, which he never did. But he goes over the social politics behind defending, on one hand, his arguments for how wages should progress at EDF, and on the other hand, dealing with the hard line of the government that controlled how much money EDF could use. So, on one hand, he's got the workers he's needing to keep in power plants, the trade unions at his throat, and here's another one. EDF was seen, rightfully or wrongly, the leader in the public sector salaries. So what EDF got would then start trickling down elsewhere. That also meant it was very hard for him to negotiate with the ministries who controlled EDF, because what EDF got would probably set the starting point for negotiating with everybody else. So Marcel had to develop to the utmost his political skills in allowing leaders of unions to show their anger and to demand, but also slowly arrive towards concessions that had already been worked out over the phone in the preceding week. For the most militant and intense labor union, the CGT, which had a very heavy presence in the leadership of Communist Party folks, it was hard to get this done, and they were often the linchpin or the outsiders looking in if the other labor unions agreed to a salary framework. But the CDG was the most difficult organization for him to have to negotiate, as far as I can tell, until later, when the rage of 68, the anti-nuclear worldview of the sort of the degrowth ecologists of 68 fully worked its way into the ministries controlling EDF. That started in the early 70s and started to get more and more intense in the decades after. So this student energy, what was it? Remember, these students would be students who are 18 to say 25, the ones born with no living memory of occupation or of the overthrow of the Germans and the liberation of France, but living in the world created by that. From their view, because I remember this being this way when I was that age, everything is in its moment. Now's the pivotal moment for a young student. That now is the most important time of history. Now is the worst it's ever been. Now is the most extreme moment where everything counts on what we do today. That was the moment in 68 that was also an anti-nuclear weapons movement, an anti-colonialism movement, an anti-Vietnam War movement. All of these things were part of one big energy. And the good thing about lumping it together as one big thing is it reduced the need to actually understand anything about electricity, much less about how to produce it with nuclear reactors. I'm not trying to say that people fighting EDF or Marcel Boiteux knew nothing about nuclear, but their knowledge about nuclear was not stemmed from needing to know about it. It was stemmed from wanting to fight it. And I will stand on that. I don't want to insult anybody, but I will stand on that. I've run into people with high knowledge of nuclear who are against it, but they tend to be of that generation that came of age and after 68. And also, it's clear that their knowledge is very sharp and pointy, motivated deep into the bowels of nuclear knowledge by needing to fight against it. So it leaves these big gaping holes and also very little context. So these students with very little knowledge of nuclear, who might have been ones to support EDF, a nationalized, a social electricity provider, instead bought it on basis of the nuclear.
So you've kind of painted this sort of glory day, both in terms of nuclear construction, well, maybe just in terms of nuclear construction, hopefully in terms of operations. One of the critiques we have here in Ontario is, we have these, fairly long leisurely outages. And some of the folks who try and explain that say, well, it's because we have so much nuclear. We're 60% nuclear powered here. We have surplus baseload in the spring and fall when our demand is low. We don't actually need to rush our outages. This is maybe applicable to France as well. I'm wondering if in sort of the heyday of Marcel's influence, the French fleet was running at higher capacity factors. Was it working better, or was that high degree of nuclear penetration, militant unions, always dragging French capacity factors to a pretty low level? I also know that they heat with electricity in France largely because of this abundance of nuclear energy, and they just don't have as much demand in summer. So I want to understand, whether they used to perform better in terms of just operations under different leadership, or whether this was the kind of anti-nuclear rot of this new generation coming in and eventually taking up managerial positions within EDF and other
Well,
institutions.
let's just first clarify. EDF was not allowed to promote electricity over other energy sources until a reform passed in 1970 that allowed EDF within certain boundaries to pursue electrification. So EDF at that time had very painful memories, according to Boiteux, of trying to promote the all-electric kitchen and being brutally savage. And that of course is funny because this push for an all-electric kitchen is now mapped to the other side of the
Right.
political spectrum, but
Yeah.
those are the weird patterns of history. Okay, so that's one. Only in 1970 was EDF allowed to start pushing things like electric heating. At the time, heat pumps weren't very good, and Marcel Boiteux was against EDF promoting them and thought that EDF promoted electric heat pumps against the best interests of their customers. He was for direct electric heating. So if we want to say he was wrong about something, well, in the end, electric heat pumps turned out to be a decent product once they got developed well. But in the time that he was promoting electric heating, that was savaged by this new left starting to get into things like energy savings, where it was bad to heat with electricity, where the understanding that it was really good system if you insulated a house and then had direct application through wires exactly when you needed it, ultra fast response, easily tunable, controllable electric heating. That was a great product. Eventually, the public voted by buying, and 75% of new homes as of 1993, when his memoirs were out, were electric heating. And it turned only later when the full power of the ecological movement got a hold of this issue and started messing with definitions and changing how energy was looked at in France and trying to get that heated with gas instead of electricity. That's one of the results of the ecological left getting into government later. But that would happen later in the 2000s, right?
But these people made a rational economic choice to heat with electricity because France
They
had managed
liked
to
it. They
produce
the
electricity that was
price was
cheap enough.
such from EDF that they could afford it on peak in the winter, and they liked the feeling of homes that was considered a premium thing to have, electric nuclear heat. So I'll say that PWRs did not regularly work with high reliability anywhere until the
Right.
mid 90s and beyond. The French had to
Post
continue to
TMI.
learn about how to operate PWRs along with the rest of us. It's only recently that they've forgotten that or have allowed the various weights of anti nuclear forces to take root so thoroughly that they have a learned helplessness and they don't seem to be able to overcome it very well. So here's another thing: developing your market is something that should happen even more intensely if you have more nuclear. And there would have been limitations in Brussels, within EDF, within the state of France, limiting that penetration, not because it was better for the price of electricity, the opposite, because it promoted the cheap nuclear. So there were lots of constraints put into the market share that EDF should be allowed to have in France. And it undercut any effort to develop a huge amount of baseload electricity users. Now the irony is that there's enough baseload electricity consumers in the industrial world for clean technologies and for data centers that EDF should be able to just clean up. But they don't have the extra power because they spent so long claiming that they don't have the extra demand. The actual shift in perspective is so hard. Almost every single EDF person I talk to, I have the same conversation where they say, "Oh, no, no, no. You don't understand. In America, of course you run baseload because you have so little nuclear compared to us. But in our country, we don't have enough demand." And then you say, "Oh, what about data centers?" And they think, "Are there data centers needing?" And you think, "Oh, they're so addicted to complaining and excusing their terrible performance that they forgot to change it and be ready for when their excuses don't hold water anymore."
Could France add a lot of data center load and still meet its peak heating
That's a statement
requirements?
of asking, can EDF run a goddamn nuclear plant? I would hope so. I would think so. EDF
So
EDF
talk
has
about
a
that. Talk
okay.
about that
EDF has like a
divergence
what
in
80
terms of
billion
beaver. Yeah.
euro plan to renovate all of its existing reactors before starting to shut them down early compared to America. So first of all, think of that. They claim, "Oh, the regulator won't let us keep it on too long, so we'll have to just um, shut it down." Okay. So first we need to renovate it, and it's going to cost a few billion per unit. And you think, why does it cost a few billion? What are you operating? No, no, we're not operating. We're just renovating, and we're meeting the safety standards. And then you see that their safety standards seem to have either they're saying that America is not staying safe and that we're intentionally endangering our public, or they've allowed an absolute unchecked, unscientific rampage in their safety regulators or the regulators of the safety regulators that are forcing them to do things that allow them to charge a bunch of money in expensive electricity rates to keep a small amount of electricity flowing. I think that's what's probably happening. It's good for everybody, but the planet, the consumer, and the clean industries of Europe that are going to have to seek their power elsewhere.
So we've definitely been hearing some, I guess, probably contrarian voices within the nuclear advocacy community arguing that the NRC ain't as bad as it's been made out to be. But the French regulator sounds like even those defenders of the NRC might have some troubles there. So maybe just go into that in a tiny bit more detail, because I forget the French name of the renovation.
ASN and IRSN is the scientific side, and ASN is the sort of the legal regulatory side, as far as I can tell. You should bring on some French people to complain about this, but the problem is they won't, because they need to be careful, whereas you and I don't really have to. I think that's part of the reason I'm here a lot. Let me just say that the phrase safety ayatollah has come up several times in my conversations, and a safety ayatollah, you get the sense of needing to show a dignity through pronouncements that are very harsh, where you think that the public has to be kept in religious awe of the safety or something will go wrong. This is not a good way to run nuclear safety in a time of extremely high nuclear popularity. And nor is it a good way to run safety in a time where you have an energy crisis in Europe. Now, the energy crisis in Europe is sort of lifting, but it's lifting with an EDF that, in my opinion, hasn't learned its lessons. It's still radically underproducing. EDF should be producing 550 terawatt hours a year. If you uprate it by 10%, which is a very normal way to uprate PWRs. In fact, the French have excellent products for uprating other people's reactors, just not their own. In fact, there was a law in 2015 that limited the maximum capacity in France, and that limitation is no longer in effect. And yet, French planning has such an awful hangover from that 2015 to 2023 period of anti-nuclear law that they can't seem to get their excuses straight when I talk to them of why they have to have that limitation on capacity or why they can't uprate. They're all confused because they've spent so long with learned helplessness and cynical, I don't know, call it make work that doesn't make more electricity within EDF, that they've forgotten the lessons of how they got to where they were in the first place, of the lessons of Marcel Boiteux, building what was needed, when it was needed, as it was needed. And I think if we had, say, Boiteux, who passed away in September 6th last year at the age of 101, watching his nuclear fleet in disarray, but with a few green shoots, with this total turnaround in the last 18 months of his life on the same politicians that were trying to destroy nuclear, trying to say that this is the foundation of French prosperity. If we learn the lessons of Boiteux, and we have intense economic analysis backed up by moral strength, by grit and hard work, I think we can redeem this French nuclear story to be what it really ought to be, which is a beacon of hope for people around the world, that you truly can have your cake and eat it too, that you can figure out what's necessary by planning it. You can execute it. It can lead to not total state control, but if anything, a flower of capitalism by provision of cheap, sustainable electricity for all, and that we can maintain it with the wisdom the wisdom of being in the first nuclear native generation, rather than suffering through the traumas of the spirit of 68 or having only the hard-sided vision of the generation that came of age during the fall of France. I think we've got to take what we have. We're worse at other things, like our cell phones distract us all the time. I thought I heard yours going off during our talk here, Chris. But on the other hand, we have the strength, which is the ability to look back at the last 100 years of industrialization with great documentation, some of the living legends still around to instruct us. We can do better. We must do better. And the French example points the way on both counts.
It is interesting. Decouple filmmaker Jesse Freeston was in Europe in the summer of 2022 and did actually stop by Marcel Boiteux's apartment, but was unable to get an interview. I'm not sure if that was the same apartment.
Different apartment. Bombed. I forgot to mention, when I talk about moral strength, In 1977, a bomb was placed at his apartment after warnings all night, every night for months. Boiteux had his wife and his young daughter just back from an internship in America at home when at 1:30 a.m. an extremely powerful bomb went off that by sheer luck did not kill him and his family. It destroyed almost the entirety of their apartment and plenty of their neighbors' apartments. And Boiteux borrowed a suit and was at labor negotiations at 9 a.m. the same day. 7.5 hours after the bomb went off, he was at labor negotiations in a borrowed suit. And do you know what the press pointed out? They pointed out that he was staying in a particularly expensive suite at the George V Hotel in Paris during this 4-day period that he didn't have a house.
Mark, I think you elegantly wrapped things up in your last little monologue there. But certainly a lot of threads to tug on and look forward into the future. And I do really plan on getting some European experts on to flesh this out if they have the freedom of speech to do so. But yeah, I mean, one thing that really seems to strike me looking forward is, as you're saying, the idea around probably closing prematurely a bunch of the glorious fleet that Marcel Boiteux brought to life, and replacing those with new EPRs. And we're all seeing sort of how that is going right now. It seems that a all of the above approach of maintaining and upgrading that fleet, getting the operations up to American style capacity factors, as well as building new reactors, is the shining path forward. But concerning that it looks like there's not the same kind of ambition to squeeze all the juice they can out of their existing fleet. Maybe we'll close it there. But if you have any final comments, and then we'll sign off and leave this topic for further exploration in future episodes.
Well, I'd just say this. Since Marcel Boiteux has left, EDF has not been able to execute nuclear construction projects well. It just hasn't. He left in 88. Since then, it's been crazy long build times. When they built 4 reactors at the same time, same type in the 90s and early 2000s, although they did get slightly better, it was still their first decade reactors, right? And it's not clear that EDF has made Framatome, that France has made money exporting nuclear reactors. Maybe the fuel, yes, but they can do that without exporting nuclear reactors. So what's funny to me is that as bad as they are operating nuclear fleets, they're worse at construction. And yet the French claim, they don't have time to think about actually operating their nuclear plants better, like in the rest of the West. They have to concentrate on upgrading them without putting out more output, turning them off right after that, and then building new plants to just have the exact same capacity as before. This is unfathomable, and I hope that there's an honest conversation in France what on earth the nuclear program is for. It can't just be for national pride. At some point, the nuclear has to be about producing a lot of clean energy at the cheapest possible rates if Europe is to have a chance against the Chinas and Americas and even the Russias of the world in our energy-dominated future.
Yeah. Well, certainly the age of the operator added something like 20 gigawatts of nuclear capacity to American production without having to build another nuclear plant. And it seems like you're mentioning jumping from something like 350 terawatt hours up to 500.
And we're extending plants.
Ghost nuclear
We're extending
plants
that were used as reference plants for the French fleet to 80 years and beyond. And the French say, oh, our regulator's too mean. Even after $1 billion in upgrades, $2 billion, we won't be allowed. So we just have to plan not to. So we have to plan to shut them down.
All right. Well, we'll leave that pregnant question in the air. What would Marcel Boiteux do? Thank you, Mark. It's been a long time coming. Great to do this episode. And for folks who are wanting to read that biography, we'll get a link to the text that you can buy online.
And I think, again, I don't want to leave people with just a negative thought. Make France great again. That's my call. And that greatness is going to come from France defending the interests of a 90 to 95% capacity factor nuclear fleet, powering all of Europe, plunging into other countries. Europe says it wants the supergrid, Chris. Then give it to them, powered by French nuclear that operates well and not badly. Bail UK out of its terrible situation. Bail out the Irish even. Bail out Spain. bail out Italy, bail out the countries that are shutting off nuclear capacity or already shut it down or can't add it. France's nuclear can be the center of a clean energy Europe if France follows the lessons of Marcel. Evaluate it carefully. Don't let politics stand in the way of the obvious operating economics of running your fleet 95% capacity factor instead of 55 or 60% or 65%, which is what they may get up to this year. You've got to operate at 95%, uprate your reactors, and make France and Europe great again. That's my call.
All right, that was actually the slogan in Glasgow at the French Pavilion. So this isn't just a Trump-tinged reference. It was used by the French themselves there at their particle board pavilion in Glasgow. Anyway, Mark, we'll leave it there. Great catching up.